This is our fourth and final lecture about the basic lessons of Heidegger's important work, Being in Time. We've only been able to really scratch the surface. Plenty of insights in this book that we've had to let go by the wayside, but I'd be remiss if we didn't talk at least a little bit with the time that we have about the second division of this book, Being in Time. We got through last time Division 1. The book that we have as published is an unfinished work, but what we have is two divisions of a planned three-division book. In Division 1, we undertook with Heidegger an existential analysis of Dasein, the kind of being, kind of big B being, that we human beings possess. And we learned that we can't talk about the human being using the Aristotelian categories that apply to things present in hand, as Heidegger would say, or objects, as we would say. No, to understand us, to understand Dasein, we need a new way of talking, a new list of characteristics that apply to the kind of being, the way of being of Dasein. And we developed a lengthening list of those existentials, as he called them, those structural features of Dasein. And we were talking last time about what does it mean to be the Da of Dasein, the there of their being. And we said that it broke down into what Heidegger identified as understanding, in the sense of a kind of competence for our own existence, for our ability to make choices and decisions and act, and also a state of mind or mood or disposition, that we're always attuned to the way we are being in the world at any given time, and how that manifests itself in discourse, in our linguistic appropriation of the kinds of beings that we had. And Heidegger said, okay, to wrap up this analytic of what it means to be Dasein, we need to get a grasp of Dasein as a whole. And he said that's pretty hard to do because Dasein is a being of possibilities, which means Dasein is a futural being, a being of the not yet, a being of what may be or what might be. So how do we get a whole picture of Dasein when the picture's not complete? And he said, well, the first hint of how we get that is to try to identify what he called the fundamental mood. Again, not in the sense that everything is based upon it, but the mood that fundamentally discloses to us our own kind of being, our own way of being, the way of being of Dasein. And he identified that fundamental mood as Angst, as anxiety or existential dread. Not to be confused with fear. Fear always takes an object based upon our concern for our being. Anxiety is objectless in that sense. It is not about this or that object in the world, not about this or that person or object or tool, like fear is. No, Angst is about being in the world as such, which means Angst is about Dasein as such. Angst is what discloses to us our own most possibilities for being. That they are possibilities and not fate and not determinations and not the they that we are in our average everyday way. That's a possibility, but that means there are other possibilities. And there are possibilities that are based on nothing, if you want to put it that way. They're over an abyss of meaninglessness. The being of meaning, which we are, is against a backdrop of meaninglessness, about nothing. Well, if you follow that so far, when you get into Division 2, it begins with the discussion of, well, then what is our own most possibility for being? Because if we could see that, we could see an opening, a possibility among many possibilities, including going along as our they self. We could see a possibility for authenticity. And that's what Division 2 of this book is about. It's about authentic Dasein. Recall the hermeneutic circle that we found ourselves in. We are, by way of interpretation, to flesh out our operative pre-understanding of our own way of being. And we want to do that in such a way as to make it our own. We learned early in the book, Dasein is in each case mine, an autos, a self, an eigen, one's own. But the way one is one's own tends to be a way that's in common with everybody else, that they self, that publicness that Heidegger is talking about. And again, not with a lot of moralizing, but just to say that's our default mode. That's our ontology of inauthenticity. But we are a being that in a sense is meant to be its own. Well, how can that happen? We have to become what we already are. We have to become. Become is an action verb. It's a dynamic word. It's an on the way kind of word. We have to become what we already are. That's a paradox, but that's the paradox of the tension that explains what it means to be Dasein. We must move beyond just our day-to-day engagements to try to grasp now our being as a whole. And our life comes to a whole. Life can be thought of in its entirety with our own most possibility, which Heidegger identifies as death. When you get to death, it's the end of the story. Your story now has been written. And Heidegger says, no one can die our death for us. It is our own. Right? It is the one thing in a way that we can't slough off on anybody else. Can't do. Each one of us will die our own death. And death, when that happens, completes life. It brings it to a close, to a whole. So a question to start this, reflections with is: would you want to live forever? I've asked this question in many classes over many years of teaching, and I, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, I tend to be talking to younger persons, and it surprises me, in fact, to learn that most young people say they would not. As I've gotten older, I find myself less and less of a hurry for my life to have its totality, to life to have been in its completeness. I'm in no hurry. But even young people recognize there is something that seems almost perverse about the idea of wanting to be eternal. And when I talk to people about it, a lot of times they think about it in terms of motivation, if I could put it that way. We already procrastinate as if we are going to live forever. We'll get to it tomorrow. But we know that we're not going to live forever, so we're kidding ourselves when we talk like that. But if somebody were to tell us, well, you are going to live forever, a lot of times, maybe at first that sounds like good news, but maybe not. Maybe you would say, well, then why would I ever do anything? What would be my motive? I mean, I would always have another tomorrow. I don't see where my motivation is coming from. And I think there's something in that way of looking at things that is resonant with what's going on with Heidegger. So let's see. Death is not just about something that happens at the end of life. And you think, wait a minute, that is the end of life. Heidegger wants to say, for the reasons really we were just hinting at, death pervades all of Dasein's existence. Dasein is a being of care, concern, and solicitude. Why do we care? Why do we bother caring? Because we know that it's not forever. We know that it's not finite. So death is an integral feature of Dasein. If it were not, you might say, well, why would I care? Death is the horizon against which our world is disclosed. And remember, world is the referential system of significance and meaning. It's our cares and our concerns and our solicitude. That's world. Every time you hear world in Heidegger, in this book anyway, that's what he's talking about. The world of Dasein, the world that is Dasein. And remember, what we talked about in a prior lecture about the hermeneutic as. We can only grasp something as something. Right? We can only understand or get a hold of things if we take them to be this rather than that. In other words, via an interpretation. We are always interpreting. We're always being hermeneutical. So horizon is that against which any interpretation can show up. The metaphor I like to use is a projector screen. If we were all sitting around in class and I had my slides and I was showing them on the room projector up against a screen, and I say, well, imagine that screen not being there, and then imagine the wall behind it not being there, nothing being there. And if I were just shining this light out into the atmosphere and we were looking in that direction, what would we see? Nothing. We would just see there would be nothing for that projection to show up on. Without that screen, no meaningful projection. Well, Dasein is a projection, right? A throwing forward towards the future. The horizon against which that projection is projected is death. If you took away the horizon, the screen of death, the project of Dasein would turn meaningless. Now, you can't experience your own death. There's never a time we are sitting around going, oh, great, now I'm dead. I'm going to sit in this box for the rest of eternity. Nope. You and death pass each other going through the door. That's how it works. You can experience your dying, and if people who end up dying of a disease, it takes a while. They can experience what that's like to kind of feel the ebbing of life, but not death. Dying, yes. Death, no. So the question Heidegger asks is, well, can we still do phenomenology here, right? This is supposed to be hermeneutical phenomenology. We're supposed to be describing how things appear, how things arise, and how we experience them, describing that. But this sounds like death is not something you can experience. So how can I describe it? Well, you might say, well, I've seen lots of other people die. We experience the death of other people, but what we're experiencing is the loss we suffer, not what the loss of life would be to them. We experience the loss of them in our life. I can't experience another person's death. I can't experience my own death. So how am I going to do a descriptive analysis of something I can't experience? It doesn't seem like it would make sense. But what Heidegger wants to say is we experience death not as an actuality, because the minute it's an actuality, you're done. There's no more experiencing for you, and no more hermeneutic phenomenology for you, and no more existentialism for you, and no more nothing for you. But we experience death as a possibility, as our own most a possibility, one we cannot avoid. And that is what Heidegger wants to do a phenomenology about. That's what he wants to help us sense and experience and not hide from. It discloses this experience of death as possibility, our finitude, the meaning that that life comes to an end, that it's not infinite, doesn't go on and on. So Dasein now has another existential, another structural feature that's built in. Heidegger calls it being towards death. Being towards death. There is no Dasein without being towards death. Dasein is a kind of way towards death. Now, before you start thinking, oh, wait a minute, you've gotten going here, and it sounds like this all is going to be grim. That's not where it's going with Heidegger. That's not what he's talking about here. He's not talking about the Dasein as if what Dasein really ought to be doing is walking around with its head down, moaning that, oh, gee, some moment, who knows, it could even be now, I'm going to be dead. How depressing is that? Not at all. That being towards death is a recognition of that horizon of finitude against which our life has meaning. If you took it away, the meaning would go away too, and Dasein would go away, and we'd be no different than other non-meaning beings, like rocks and trees. So it's a fundamental feature of what it means to be Dasein. And this being towards death recognizes the ultimate possibility for a being whose big B being, whose way is possibility. The ultimate possibility for that kind of being is no more possibility. The possibility of the impossibility anymore of Dasein. This possibility, Heidegger says, rips us out of our they self. Anxiety opens the door to recognize being towards death. Recognition of being towards death rips us out of our they self. Yes, of course, just like you would expect, almost just like you would want. There is a public interpretation of death. That we talk about it. Death is a part of life, and we have different practices, and we do planning, and we have life insurance and all that kind of stuff. But there can't be an average interpretation of my death, right? There's no way to get it. I can't experience the death of others. I can't experience my own death. What I get is some kind of smokescreen that makes me think I'm considering death as a part of life, as they say, without really considering it. Being towards death then opens up the possibility of authenticity. Being towards death could be viewed as that which Heidegger said earlier is rare, authentic anxiety. Anxiety that lets itself feel its anxiety, that lets itself own its anxiety. And what is that anxiety? It's a recognition of the possibility of no more possibilities, a recognition of finitude, of contingency, as the screen for allowing us to actually care and be concerned and be solicitous and make choices and become the people we are. So death individualizes us. Let's talk about that again. We recall we had two steps that we've discussed so far about individualization, becoming an individual, which has got to be a part of authenticity. The first is we are individualized as they selves, as another one of everybody else, a constructed, configured individual. What would that be? A construction of social media, a consumer, a cog in a capitalist economic system, something like that. Second, though, in anxiety, we're re-individualized as one who feels uncanny, one who feels not at home in the world, an individual without a content, with nothing, worried about the nothing, recognizing the nothingness. Where the world, which is our referential system of significance, has fallen away from us. I'm alone here, and I don't know where here is anymore. I'm not at home. I don't know who I am. We flee from that anxiety. We don't like it. We flee into the comforting and tranquilizing and numbing public world of whatever, busyness or excessive media or shopping or hedonism or whatever it is we do, veg out in front of the television, whatever. We get to feeling at home again. We just try to push that anxiety away, sometimes in what we would say, with healthy strategies and sometimes with very unhealthy strategies. But we have a tendency to want to push that anxiety away from us as quickly as possible because it doesn't really feel good. We feel alone and lost. We don't like that. And remember, this applies to everybody. Anxiety is an existential of Dasein. It's something everyone copes with. Again, maybe to use words Heidegger doesn't, some of us cope with it in healthy ways, others with unhealthy strategies. But it can go along with a strong sense of self-assurance, a strong sense that I, for one, do not have anxiety. That, for Heidegger, would very likely be a person who has gotten so comfortable in the they world of, climbing the corporate ladder and doing the things one does and just the way one does them and being recognized for doing things the way one does them, that we don't feel that anxiety. That's why he says this real anxiety is rare. But now we have a third moment of individualization where we're in what he calls authentic anxiety. We realize our own being towards death. Now we have an eigen, an autos, a self, my own. I take ownership of the one and only life that I have in this, in my finitude. That's the chance. That's the opening. That's the door for authenticity. And, Heidegger knew his Hegel. We talked about Hegel, and remember the dialectic, the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. Remember those three moments of dialectical becoming? You could kind of see that here, right? There's the first moment where, of course, I'm an individual. I'm a student. I'm an American. I'm an athlete. Whatever. That's me. I know that's me. That's the me that I am. But then, anxiety hits. And it could hit for all kinds of reasons. There could be an accident. You could lose a job. There could be somebody that you love dies, or somebody rejects you. It could be something good. You fall in love when you weren't expecting, or you find out you're going to have your first child. Or you could take a course in existentialism. That'll awaken this anxiety in you. Well, it'll hit you, and you'll say, "Wait a minute! Now I am not all those constructed identities that they say that I am and ought to be. I am something else. But what else? So first, I have a content that's supposed to be me. And then I realized that there's a me that doesn't have a content. So there's a content, but it's not really me. And there's a me that doesn't really have a content. That's the second moment, the antithesis. The third moment is kind of a synthesis where you take ownership of all that. You take it back into yourself and be, if you can, to be authentic. Heidegger thinks death is fundamentally freeing. Now, again, death is not some event that happens either in the next 5 minutes or the next 50 or 100 years. He doesn't mean it as a single event, because if he meant it like that, it would free you from the hassles of hanging around the life world. He doesn't mean it like that. Death for him is a possibility, our own most possibility. It's something that pervades life from the moment that we come into this world, that we didn't ask to be born, that we were thrown into this world. Simone de Beauvoir likes to say, the minute you're born, you're old enough to die. It's part of the makeup of what Dasein is all about. And if you recognize and take ownership of the possibility, it's freeing. That's what he's talking about. If the ultimate possibility is impossibility, then whatever our they self says we are is recognized as only one possibility among others. And he says that breaks the stranglehold of the they. Now, all of this plays itself out, and we don't have a lot of time to talk about all the details of this. It's actually quite fascinating, but it's the second main word in the three-word title of the book, time, right? We've been talking about being. Now we need to talk a little bit about time and temporality, and what Heidegger calls authentic temporality. As you can imagine, there's inauthentic temporality. We don't really have time to discuss that, unfortunately. But what does he mean here? How is a temporal being like us to live in an authentic kind of way? So, okay, temporality is not some kind of track that we are riding down from past through present to future. It's not anything outside of us. Just like spatiality is primordially a feature of Dasein, an existential of Dasein, and because it is, we could talk about space sometimes when it's handy in terms of feet and inches. Temporality, it's a fundamental feature of Dasein's experience, a fundamental feature of Dasein's makeup. It's structural, it's ontological, it's existential. And because it is, sometimes it makes perfect sense to talk about the clock and to talk about the calendar. It's part of our structure, though, temporality. Temporality, he says, has a tripartite or a three-part structure. He refers to them as the three ecstasies of time. And you can hear that word ecstasy in there. And again, that's similar to existence, existare. It's a standing out that he's trying to capture here phenomenologically. He says, first of all, we are thrust ahead of ourselves, projected. Remember we said Dasein is a projection. We are projected towards our possibilities. That's why we can think of our lives in terms of projects, of where we're headed, our not yets, our authentic future. And Heidegger says the authentic way is to live in what he calls anticipation. Now, he distinguishes that, and there's a lot of nuance to this, but he distinguishes anticipation from expecting or waiting around. So In our inauthentic selves, we expect things to happen. Well, I'm in high school. I just expect to go to college, and I, expect to graduate, and then I expect to get a job, then I expect to get a paycheck, and I expect to get a house, and someday I expect to die. Just in a way, busily waiting around to die. That's inauthentic. That's not living your life as your own. It's not authentic. Anticipation, he thinks of as something that somehow leaves the possible future as possibility. Remember, when you're expecting or waiting, you've already foreclosed on a lot of possibilities. I'm going to college, then I'm getting the job, then I'm getting married, then I'm getting the promotion, then I'm dying, right? You've foreclosed on a lot of possibilities. You've cut out a lot of possibilities. Anticipation is a way of staying open to those possibilities. However, you can never forget this. It's going to come back when we talk about the French existentialist as well. Our possibilities are always conditioned by our concrete situation, our facticity. And what is that? Well, the facts of your life are everything you've done, everything that's happened to you, things that you had control over, things that you did not have control over, all of your no longers, all of your past. Are, as I put it, bells you cannot unring. They happen to you. If you try to deny it, we think that's unhealthy. That's denial. It's untrue. You're not in the truth. You're a college student. There's no way to say that you're not. I'm a prof. There's no way to say that I'm not. But we tend to think a lot of times that our past has just set the tone for what the future is going to be. It's just the past somehow dictates what's going to happen in the future, as if our facticity is our fate. But our facticity is not our fate. What we need to do is to take that past and take ownership of the possibilities to be found in that past. Not think of the past strictly as actualities, which of course they are. They happened. No denying it. But to think of them as possibilities. And Heidegger thinks that again, there's this inauthentic and authentic way of treating our past. We can either try to forget that it happened, be in denial, walk away from it, say it didn't have anything to do with anything. You could do that, or you can, if you to be authentic, you would want to. Heidegger says, view the past with repetition. Or retrieval, wiederholen, do it over again. What does that mean? What is a repetition? It does not mean repetition like if you put a sheet of paper in a copy machine and say made 100 copies and it just boom, 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 it spits them out. Like you live your life by just doing the same thing over and over again, same stuff, different day, that kind of attitude. No, that's not what Heidegger is talking about here. A great example of what he is talking about here would be art. Let's take as an example the art of Monet, Claude Monet. Look at his paintings of Parliament. Look at his paintings of Waterloo Bridge. Look at his paintings of water lilies or the Rouen Cathedral. He did dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of pictures of the same subject. He did it at different times of the day, in different kinds of light, in different kinds of weather, at different times of the year, when he was in different frames of mind. And he would go and sit in the quote-unquote same place and look at quote-unquote the same subject for his painting, like this bridge or like this building, and he would paint them. But yet what makes Monet a wonderful artist is not that he was just doing the same thing over and over and over again. Each one of those had a uniqueness that is not found in the other ones, even though you could say, oh, that's another picture of water lilies, or that's another picture of that bridge. It's not just another picture of that bridge. He has found in those moments, in those subjects, something new again, some other kind of possibility, something else that can be brought out of that. And repetition really, again, he's getting a lot of this from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard wrote a book with that title. And it's a tremendous insight. And I hope, I know we're going very fast, but I hope you get a chance to think about what that would mean. Not a denial of your past, but a way of picking it up and finding new possibilities in them. And thus, if you can do that, in that in-between of anticipation and repetition, in this moment, Dasein, Heidegger says, resists the present age. And there's that the title of that piece by Kierkegaard. Again, we resist the present age, the present way of things as not mine, and resolves to become who Dasein is. It's the moment of free decision, an authentic present. Heidegger says it's a moment of vision. The German word is Augenblick, which literally means the blink of an eye. And again, there's an inauthentic way of being in the moment, which he calls preoccupation. You're just fidgeting with whatever that you're doing. It might not feel like fidgeting. You might even be doing something that you get highly paid for. There's a lot of stuff that you do. You're just making the moments, but it's done in a they kind of way, without really seeing your life as yours and seeing the possibilities in your life in that moment. So the key to authenticity is what Heidegger calls anticipatory resoluteness. We're finite beings. Our finitude presents the horizon against which our lives have meaning. We are beings towards death. Our wholeness or our completeness is a function of the fact that we die. Not wholeness like we get to the end of the story and all the data, all the facts about me can be put in the book, but to live a whole life now, to live a full life now, requires a recognition of our being towards death. And if we approach this authentically, we live with anticipation. We're not just waiting around for some actuality that's just not here yet. We're really living with the possibilities of our lives. And Heidegger says, if you do that, that's not easy. That puts a claim upon this. And here in the book, he starts speaking of guilt and the call of conscience. And again, it sounds, again, the moralistic language that Heidegger tends to use. But he means this more structurally and what it means to just be Dasein. Guilt or the call of conscience, again, are not moral terms. They are structures. They're existentials. Guilt is structural for us. In a way, you can, if you squint a little bit, see that notion as a rewrite of St. Augustine's idea of original sin. Remember when we talked about that? Original sin is a self-transcendence. It's this idea, not that we did some crime once upon a time, or somebody in our human family did some crime once upon a time, but it's structural. It's a structural feature of what it means to be a human being, a creature made in God's image. And anyway, this represents guilt and the call of conscience, an interruption of the publicness of Dasein, an interruption of that. It brings us back to ourselves. Conscience, he says, is a mode of authentic Dasein, which of course is care. Conscience then is a mode of care, an authentic mode of care. And this conscience, has three modes. Again, the future mode, the projection, the looking forward to getting it, the be competent. And in guilt, what are we saying? We're saying my possibilities are not whatever they say they were. My possibilities become my responsibility. The ones that I actualize, the ones that I don't actualize. My possibilities become mine. That's what he means by guilt, structural. Thrownness, again, is always with us. We are factical beings. We are thrown into the world. We are attuned, and our attunement to our thrownness shows up in anxiety, which again is structural. It's always with us. It's not some kind of condition that we want to try to get past. And then discourse, not fallenness here, not the inauthentic idle talk and chitter chat. But what Heidegger says now, the authentic way to be is quiet. Instead of talking, instead of trying to put it into words and foreclose on everything, he's counseling a kind of reticence, a remaining silent, so that we can hear this call of conscience to take ownership of our being and to own our choices responsibly. We tend to make a lot of noise so we don't hear that call of conscience. See, the they tries to not let us hear that so that we go along and get along, and we ourselves know that in guilt we stand alone and we stand responsible, and we don't always feel comfortable with that, and we try to avoid it. But if we adopt a certain kind of reticence in our being, a certain kind of silence, we are able to hear that call of conscience, recognize our guilt, meaning only recognizing our responsibility. I say only, but that's big. Recognizing our responsibility for our lives and our choices. So resoluteness is about guilt, anxiety, and reticence. To be resolute means to be resolved, to be your own Dasein, to own your own Dasein authentically. Anticipatory resoluteness is what Heidegger means by authentic Dasein. And what this amounts to is a particular kind of interpretation of your being. One of many possible interpretations of your being. Again, not a very likely interpretation of any of our beings, because we tend to default to our ontological inauthenticity. Right? This would mean what we would be if we were authentic would be the hermeneutical being authentically hermeneutical, recognizing that our lives are a matter of interpretations and choices and decisions for which we're responsible. And all of this is a task, and I can't stress this enough. Ontologically, structurally, the kind of thing that we are, however each one of us plays it out, ontologically, we are inauthentic. That's an existential of Dasein. But we have to become, or we might become, ontically, as a matter of fact, one possibility rather than another, we could become ontically authentic, which would be an existential modification of Dasein, an actualized possibility, one among many. So to be authentic, it's a modification of the they selves we generally are and have been since we were thrown into this world. That's why it's unusual. Now, at this point, you might say, could you give me a picture of this? Could you tell me a little bit about what an authentic Dasein would look like? How would an authentic Dasein go about its day? What would that look like? And if you search Heidegger's book, you're not going to really find any examples. He's giving you a schematic for what authenticity would look like, anticipatory resoluteness. He's giving you the schema of that, the outline of that, but he can't fill in all the details. Now, you might think, well, maybe he just doesn't understand it. Maybe he got that far and he just sort of ran out of steam, or he lacks imagination. So, well, I want to give you an analogy. Karl Marx gets this same criticism. Marx, you go on and on and on with your criticism of capitalism, down to every last detail. And look, let's say for the argument, I'm persuaded that you're right, that we will always be alienated until the tensions that are integral to capitalism are overcome, and they will only be overcome in communism. And in communism, human nature will become its true self. What does it look like? What does the day look like in a real communist society? Not the Soviet Union. Marx would have had nothing to do with that, quite frankly. But in a real communist society, what would it look like? And Marx wrote a ton, shelf load of books and articles, but he doesn't really say that much about it. He says, well, it'd be the kind of thing where, you could do one thing in the morning and something else in the afternoon, and nobody would be an accountant or a professor or a fisherman, but you could fish freely, or you could teach if you had something to teach, or you could learn if you had something you wanted to learn from somebody. But you wouldn't be any one of those things. That would not be your identity. Those are social constructions, and in a capitalist society are constructed to the advantages of capital, not to labor like you and me. But I can't tell you what it would look like, because what it would mean is you'd be free. We don't know what freedom looks like because we're not free. It's very hard to picture what it would really look like. Even our own minds, even our own values have been shaped by the unfreedom we find ourselves in this particular politico-economical system. Okay, same with Heidegger. Heidegger's trying to say, look, the whole of the history of philosophy and theology has basically been lining up to tell you what you're supposed to do, as if there were some owner's manual, as if there was some blueprint or settled description of exactly what it would mean to be an authentic human being, to be one's own. We don't do that. If Heidegger wrote a book that said, all right, listen up, people, I've explained to you, that ourselves are constructions, and they're not our own. We didn't do most of the building work for our own identities. But now that you've heard my course, you probably have some anxiety. Good. That opens the door. Now you can ask the question. Now you can see your life as possibilities. So here's what you ought to do with your possibilities. If he wrote that last phrase, he would have undone everything he's done in this book. He would have done the exact opposite thing that he's been arguing for the whole time. He is not arguing that you should be like Heidegger. He is arguing you should be like you. And if you say, well, I don't know what that means, Heidegger says, well, right. You have to determine it by your choices and actions and your responsibility and ownership of those choices and actions, and then you will be authentic. But I can't tell you in advance what it would look like because possibilities are always not yet. And everything you do actualize itself just opens up another possibility until your life ends. So I can't tell you what it looks like. I could just tell you what it would mean to be free in a schematic kind of way, because freedom is it's anatomical. You got to put the flesh on those bones. If somebody puts it on for you, you're not free. That's, I think, what Heidegger is arguing. I think that's, in many respects, why Marx was not able to answer that question either. It would undo what they were trying to do, and definitely in the case of Heidegger, even more so than Marx. What human Dasein authentically would be like would be up to each Dasein to own for Dasein's own self. There's no getting around it. Nobody said that would be easy. So, all right, that is the gist of Being in Time, and I just want to say one thing about the rest of Heidegger's career, which is totally unfair to the rest of Heidegger's career, but I do want to make a point of what came after. Being in Time was written early, in 1927. You know that he worked many decades after that, and there's many changes that went through Heidegger's thought. He really, in many respects, has been seen, it's debatable, but has been seen to have left the project of Being in Time behind. And if that's right, then this would be where the change comes. This would be the pivot point of the reversal. In later Heidegger, it's no longer Dasein that interprets being, but it's being itself that interprets Dasein. Or as he says in a different context, it's not that human beings speak language, language speaks human beings. Something like that. All right? Now that's hard to talk, to kind of get your head around, but what he's trying to say is it's not just authentic and inauthentic human Dasein doing what they do, and then that's what being is all about. Heidegger thinks there are historical, temporal sending of ways of being that shape Dasein rather than Dasein shaping being. And the era in which he found himself and we find ourselves is the era of technology. Heidegger uses the German word Gestell, which means enframing. So our whole being is like a frame that frames us in a certain kind of way, puts us in a certain kind of light, puts us in a certain kind of position, and frames us. And that way is technological. So we are techno-sapiens, techno-beings that are being shaped by forces greater and bigger than us. Now, we can have a lot of talk about that. That reminds you maybe of Hegel, this old idea that, who are we and what are societies and what are cultures? Well, it's the divine mind sort of playing itself out. Whether this is a Hegelian moment in Heidegger or not, that's a very long and interesting discussion that we can't have. But this turning here is what leads to a break between Heidegger, without whom there would be no existentialism, without being in time, there would be no existentialism, and existentialism, and the break between what Heidegger and Husserl got started and with where it went, especially with the French, who we're going to talk about next. Because the French, to put it very simply, oversimply, found the existential analytic of Heidegger to be the thing, to be what it's all about. Heidegger said, no, my thought, not what you're calling existentialism, but my thought is not like your thought. Your thought is a humanism. In fact, the next thing we'll read will be an essay, a lecture by Jean-Paul Sartre called "Existentialism is a Humanism." And a colleague of Heidegger's told him about this lecture and how popular it was and what people were saying about it, and asked Heidegger, "What do you think? If they are they right? They understood you?" And Heidegger wrote a letter back to this person, a letter the size of a book, by the way, a pretty decent sized book, now known as Letter on Humanism, the Letter on Humanism, where Heidegger says, I don't know what they're doing. They're doing humanism. They're saying everything comes down to human consciousness and human practice. I'm not doing that. Being is what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in what humans are doing, and being is not a function of the human. The human is a function of being. They have it wrong. Well, we'll see whether you think they have it wrong or not, but we will certainly get to that soon.